Hey everybody, it's Tripl-L coming in to talk about My Hero Academia Season 5, Episode 12. This is my quick episode review here for the anime-only viewers. I've also made a comparison video for anyone that's curious. Feel free to go check it out. It should be on the channel at the same time this video is up. Anyway, let's just get into it. I hope everyone is having a good day. My Hero Academia Episode 12. So, this episode, I think you could agree that it's a transition episode. When you get into it, you can see that we're just moving along the scenes and we're setting up for the next arc, more or less. Sort of. And if we were following the manga, I would have said we were setting up for the next arc pretty aggressively. Because there are some big differences here, but let's just keep it to this episode. On this episode, we go through quite a few things, right? We go through first the Shinzo cleanup. This was the end of chapter 216. So we clean up the whole thing with Shinzo. We find out that he is going to be joining class 1A or 1B. I believe he's joining class 1A because it's Aizawa there, and I do think I saw images from the recent Hero Academia art show that showed Shinzo with class 1A. So I would be very... It hasn't come up in the manga yet, but I'm pretty sure he's in class 1A. It just doesn't make sense to keep him away from Aizawa. Anywho, there's beyond that, we have the Shinzo stuff. Then we go into Izuku's issues with One for All and figuring stuff out. After that sequence, we cut to getting the explanation from Monoma. So Monoma's blank rhetoric is explained. I also have a video explaining the whole situation with Monoma. Point of the matter is, if it's got accumulation type stuff going on in it, Monoma can't copy the quirk properly because he can't copy accumulation. It's pretty much Monoma can only do a shallow copy. He can't do a deep copy. Anyway, after that, we have just set up for Shoto. He's going to be asking Endeavor for help, and I believe after that point overall, we go into the next sequence, which is Shoto and Bakugo finally getting their license, and we see them fighting enemies, and we have a character introduced. Now, in that final sequence, when we have Bakugo and Shoto dealing with those carbonated water guys, that's where some of the setup is for the next little bit, and you'll have to keep that part in mind because that sequence has been, well, has had its context ripped out of it. So keep that in mind as we go into the future, because that's going to be one of the important sequences just for the framing of what's going on in the background. But otherwise, those are the elements. Now, when we come back and let's talk about the episode proper, and then let's talk about the detailed parts. When it comes to the episode, in this episode, we have a segment where Aizawa and Present Mike are talking, and Present Mike mentions a very particular name, Shirakumo. So in the manga, there was originally an image of that character that would have happened. What's going on here is this is, when you're looking at this, this is flat out just a setup for Aizawa's backstory. So keep that in mind, keep that name in mind, try and remember that name. It's likely going to come up this season if we get lucky with the timing. Actually, no. Might not come up till next season if I get the numbers right. Okay, either this season or next season. So that's one of the big elements that should be taken away from the episode, the Aizawa setup. And then when we go into the other element of the episode, so when it comes to Izuku, one thing you'll notice is that the episode makes a big deal of this whole connection with All for One. You have Izuku gazing at his hand, being like, All for One's power, huh? And then you have a conclusion to that idea when Izuku's like, yeah, even if it's All for One's power, I'll still make use of it. Honestly, this rhetoric, not the best. It was pretty clumsy in the manga. It's pretty clumsy here again, for very obvious reasons, and I'll go through that because this is how I would have criticized it had I done the manga. Now, I'm not going to use the translations from the episode because last week I realized that, thanks to you guys, that there were mistakes in the translations that I had. So I'm going to just reference flat out what the manga said because the manga's writing is ultimately going to have more weight than the anime's. When you have an emotional crux in the episode being about Izuku's connection to All for One, it's important to remember the exact stipulations here. Now, the translation file I had for the episode says stuff like One for All originally came from him, right? And then it says other things like All for One's power. And throughout the episode, you see how we got into that position, because Bakugo made the comparison, well, like, All for One has multiple powers, you have multiple quirks as well. You guys are connected. Just to read you what the manga originally said, Izuku was saying that the vestiges told him that the time was right, it could be some external factor, and Bakugo went and concluded, yes, something to do with All for One, because he's the one who basically created One for All, right? Isn't it an offshoot of his power? He's also got multiple quirks that makes you the same as him. So what I really want to hit on here is because of the way that Izuku internalized it. We can't forget, this power only works because One For All's brother had the first quirk. It's not an issue of this is All For One's power. The only thing that All For One contributed was the stockpile quirk. At the end of the day, All For One and his brother, they have similar genetics. They likely got related quirks because of that reason. They're family. We know how quirks work. They come along in this format. When you look at the episode, it looks as though the characters are putting all the focus on All For One, as if they're ignoring the biological reality that it takes two to tango here. When it comes to the manga, even Bakugo saying, isn't this an offshoot of All For One's power? No, it's not. How could you say it's it exists because of his intervention, 100%, but it exists because of his brother's existence in of itself. If his brother doesn't have the quirk to pass on quirks, this doesn't work. All For One does not contribute anything to the whole aspect of Izuku being able to have multiple quirks. The reason that I'm harping on this is because of the way that Izuku ultimately has to internalize it. And when you have a conclusion like he's also got multiple quirks, that makes you the same as him. Like, you understand what is trying to be said, but they are forcing it. That's the bigger message. They are really trying to force a particular idea here onto Izuku without properly acknowledging the biological realities that occur here, and without properly giving credit. I guess the big thing, they're giving so much credit to All For One compared to the fact that this doesn't work without his brother's contribution. Like, if anything, this is a product between two brothers. So, you know, if I was to look at the manga translation, even just saying it's an offshoot of his powers, like, no. I mean, you can only say it's an offshoot because the two are related and the brother already had a component that is part of it. Yeah, but in context, it's just busted rhetoric, and the conclusions that it makes Izuku go through just they don't land just right with me. And I think the conclusion here is like, when you have Izuku thinking like, oh, you know, this makes you the same as All For One, then he says like, no, this power will be my ally. It's like, why are you reaffirming that this power is going to be your ally? There has been no instance after talking to the vestiges where the idea that this power doesn't want to work with you is even on the table. And this is ultimately where you go when you engage in shoddy rhetoric. I just don't understand how you can end up in the conclusion where you have to reaffirm to yourself that you're going to be different than All For One, when the people inside of you are in general positive people who are against All For One. We know the root of One For All, and that is to stand against All For One. We know that Black Whip in context manifested because Izuku was angry, and also because Izuku wanted to capture Monoma. Like, the rhetoric just doesn't mesh together. When you're reading this, what it really comes off as is just they had to slot in an emotional hook for Izuku to give him some kind of new goal for the future. Because like, you understand what he's ultimately trying to say at the end, right? The problem is really the comparison to All For One. Because at the end of the day, you could have just said, yeah, you know what, I'm going to gain control of this power. You don't have to add that extra context of, I'm going to gain control of this power and be different than All For One. The comparison to All For One was never on the table. It only came on the table when Bakugo started talking about it. And yes, I know that I am splitting hairs here, but it's for the sake of the discussion. Like, the reality is, Hero Academia is a relatively high-tier show. When it makes mistakes, they're usually going to be on the level that they're so slight that all you can really do is talk about implications or talk about how this could possibly go wrong in another series. It's just one of the unfortunate realities about talking about a relatively high-tier series in anime. It's just, if you're going to look for issues, a lot of them are usually going to be like on very small technicalities. Now, I'm not going to talk about the Monoma stuff because I have a video about it, and it makes sense in this episode. The next segment that does have my attention is definitely the whole thing at the end. We have Bakugo and Shoto fighting these different villains. So the 2 points that are worth talking about when it comes to the episode is the introduction of this hero. This guy had a chapter title after him. It was actually the chapter that was adapted here was named Slide and Go or something like that. So interestingly, he was, I guess, kind of important. I mean, he got a chapter named after him. But the bigger points to note are that these guys were using inferior goods from the black market, and there was an emphasis on these devices because we saw him like putting out a lot of power. Just keep this in mind, because this is going to be referenced in the future, this idea about inferior goods from the black market and the general focus on support items. I don't know if you remember back in season 1 or season 2, people were talking about black market dealings when it came to support market. So keep that in mind, because this is really just a nice follow-up to an idea that was happening very early on in Hero Academia. Now, next week, we are going to be dealing with I believe, Christmas? Which, very interesting. It's going to be a nice time to see all the characters getting together and having a nice little party. But this is very out of sequence. If you want to know, this chapter adapted up to chapter 219, and Christmas happens like beyond 240. So it's going to be very interesting what exactly the anime is going to do here. Right now, the anime has stripped out some context from the situation, and it's going to be interesting to see how they kind of bring it all back together. Mind you, like when it comes to the manga, like maybe the structure for the chapter that was adapted, it was maybe a little bit confusing. So honestly, the anime is in a good position here to make things a little bit more streamlined. But unfortunately, they do lose a little bit of framing because of the way they went about this. Now, when it came to the episode, any other little details? Of course, I love the characters having their little powwow moments. I love the little party at the end. I like seeing the character interact and get to be kids. Those scenes are always my favorite. One of the scenes I found really cute was Suyu hibernating because of her frog power, you know. She can't handle the cold. That was really neat. Come on. It 100% was. But overall for this episode, it was a transition episode. It set up Izuku's next goal in general, that being he's going to control One for All. Oh, one interesting thing was that Izuku was talking about locking mechanisms for One for All. This is really interesting whenever we talk about the One for All quirk being able to limit its power, because this is what makes Izuku stand counter to a really interesting idea, that being quirk singularity. Quirk singularity is based on the idea that power is not compatible with the body, or quirks evolve faster than the body can handle. But in Izuku, you have an example of a guy who has a quirk that his body can't handle, but the quirk is able to limit itself such that Izuku's body can later handle it. When you have Izuku talking about how like the thought of wanting to lock it up locked up the quirk, that's a really interesting mechanism when you look at the power structure of One for All. And it's definitely one of the more elegant things that occurs in Hero Academia. I would say keep an eye out for this idea that Izuku's quirk stands against quirk singularity. It hasn't popped up yet, like no one's acknowledged this, but I do kind of feel like maybe we'll get some kind of conclusion about that in the future. Just because at this stage, One for All has one of the most interesting locking mechanisms when it comes to dealing with singularity. Anyway, everyone, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks so much for watching. I don't got any more points for this episode. Till next time, I hope you have an absolutely great day.